The Queen's hand sat watching the final preparations for his carriage. He was leaving with one of the mages, Ariel, who would accompany him on his trip and also engage with the mages of the south. They had enough security to be a small army, and rightly so, as the Queen did not want anything to go wrong on the trip. She had also given her hand many gifts for the king, and a scroll written in her own hand, sealed, that would be delivered directly to the king. The Guinea flag flapped high above the carriage as they prepared, its blue and turquoise colors shining proudly in the sunlight. The geologists had predicted that the weather would be fair for the next week, so they should not have any troubles traveling down. The carriage departed on its maiden voyage trip to the south. Traveling through the kingdom was uneventful as always, as there was nothing new to see. The roads were laid with black rock, a smooth rock which made travel very smooth and comfortable. After a while, they arrived in the southernmost district and spent the night before leaving the lands and beginning the treacherous journey over the outlands. The carriage rolled through the outlands at a steady trotting pace. To the far right they could see the mountains towering to the heavens, and to their left the desert. The safe road was in between the mountains and the true desert of the outlands. The land here was a mix of dry and dusty soil, with spots of trees and shrubs, rocks and boulders scattered everywhere. The road that had been carved out had been the first major joint effort of North and South, each side working for their own lands and meeting in the middle. Its position was perfect, in that it was slightly too far west for the pirates to venture, though they had been daring attempts at times, and close enough for a retreat to be made to the mountains, and to defend from a high ground position. It was also situated in between areas of high rocky ground that were far enough to be a difficult hill to climb for pirates. Even if they did, it was too far to be an attack point. The road also detoured behind the city of Dan, going directly to King's Crown in a smaller carriageway, ideal for their contingent, but would be far too inadequate for the Queen's full entourage. The carriages rolled along quietly, flanked by the Guinea soldiers, both mage and infantry. At various intervals, mage soldiers would, in groups of 3, port away from their horses, appearing at the far dunes. After a few minutes of watching the desert, they would return to their horses. The horses were actually mage trained, as they called it. This entailed casting spells around the animal, such that it got used to the bright lights and sudden appearances or disappearances of individuals, and would not panic in combat. The Queen's hand sat reading a fictitious manuscript written by their local scribes, a book based on murder and mystery. It was an intriguing piece of work and passed the time perfectly. There were suddenly loud voices outside, and the carriage came to an abrupt stop, causing Barak to be pressed against the wall of the carriage and thrown forward, stretching his arms out to catch himself lest he fall to the floor. He quickly composed himself and leaned over, peering out the window. There was an uneasy silence outside, with nothing moving. A mage soldier appeared in a blue flash and spoke to one of the soldiers. There were added instructions, inaudible to Barak, and horses moved. The carriage remained still for what seemed eternity. Barak felt his stomach tighten from being trapped in that state of not knowing and waiting, which was worse than knowing, with the same. He got up and walked the length of the carriage and peered out the other window. Then he saw it, far off behind the ridges, rising plumes of dust. He could not tell if they were approaching or going by, but his heart grew anxious as the cloud seemed to grow, blooming into the sky. He'd had his fair share of pirates in his many years as a hand to the royal family, and he knew they were a brutal group, attacked quickly, looted savagely, and left just as fast. Anyone hindering that process was immediately cut down. The infantry soldiers had already created somewhat of a defensive perimeter, as instructed by their commanders. Barak's heart tightened as he watched the plume of smoke continue to rise, dissipating into the blue sky. Uneasy eyes in the entire convoy watched the cloud cautiously. Most of them had barely left the kingdom borders, and now, on their first day out, potentially faced the foe that they had only heard of from their peers in nightmarish descriptions, who had faced them and lived to tell the tale. On the far ridge, mage soldiers watched the group of pirates racing across the desert lands. Even from this distance, they could be seen crouched low, peering over the edge of the dune at the unknown riders. The density of the cloud grew thinner until the skies looked clear again. Another mage soldier flashed into the area. There were exchanges, and suddenly the formation changed, returning to flanking the carriages. The doors opened, and a soldier popped his head in. "Apologies, sire. A troop of pirates in the distance, returning probably with a large bounty. No interest in us." The queen's hand nodded, a great sense of relief filling his heart, causing him to sigh and take the nearest seat. He peered a cautious eye out of the window to the far ridge. The dust could still be seen, staining the day's sky, a light brown that disappeared as it rose high above. He felt truly at peace when the carriage jumped forward and his heart rested again, allowing him the environmental peace to return to his book. Aramaros sat wondering what he had seen in the north. There the royal family had power, true power, and control. The queen was what King Roshem should be, power over all. The mages there were exactly what they should be, soldiers that followed orders, and that was it. The high mage was more of a ceremonial position than anything that carried weight, comparable to a highly religious person whose beliefs were appreciated in decision making, but never a guideline. His mind twisted and turned to find a way to twist the powers that be to claim their rightful position as being the true power of the kingdom. As he did, he drifted to thoughts of his next trip. The king had tasked him to go to the east to see one of the senators who he had found in debt to the crown because of his actions. He was going to ensure that they kept their word to the king to keep accurate records of their district so as to receive accurate disbursements from the royal treasury. Aramaros pondered on how such a situation could be used in his favor, as he always did when presented with someone indebted to the crown. There was always leverage to be gained, and loyalty for tasks unknown in the future. One could never underestimate the benefits of having favors owed to you. Favors were a currency worth all their weight in gold, and he kept an admirable purse. The queen's hand from the north would soon arrive, and he hoped he'd be able to get a deeper insight into the workings of their kingdom and the structures. Maybe the visit would allow the king to see things differently, a better system of rule, and he would adopt it. After all, it was his to claim. Aramaros clicked his tongue. His initial visit was based solely on introduction, and he didn't want to jeopardize that by seeming it was a fact-finding mission. But, as his experience had taught him, he threw in enough open statements to allow the queen's hand to speculate on implied possibilities, which he undoubtedly must have informed the queen about. Given the shrinking time frame, the queen's hand from the north would arrive and leave before he had a chance to see him and converse. Hence he had the urgency of going to the east now, deal with this incompetent senator who had cut a tree while sitting on its branches. For Aramaros, it was essential to see the queen's hand, such that he would return to the north with more ideas to feed to the queen. When the High General and the queen would visit, he would put a true squeeze on the Sarah. But that Muriel, that grand Sarah. He clicked his tongue again. She was smarter than she let on, and he had underestimated her, which was foolish of him, since she was the Grand Sarah, and could not have achieved that without some heightened level of intelligence. He rocked slowly in his chair, frowned, clicking his tongue again, his thoughts in clear frustration. Power was the only currency worth anything, and for him to have it, he would have to grow his influence on its custodians. His ascension to King's Hand was no small feat. He was born from servants under the royal house and lived his entire life in servitude of the kings, starting with the king's father and now son. He knew more about their golden-laden halls than any other, including the glorified outgods. He scorned clicking his tongue again. The senator was the initial priority. A man in debt was a slave, his father would always say. Great advice from a man who had lived a life of debt to pay to the royal family after being spared of death in exchange for working for the king. How fitting a scenario. Aramoros never really knew the reason for the debt, and somehow that story eluded him. Then again, he always rationalized that the act committed by his father may have been so heinous that the old man preferred to carry the story to his grave than share such a history. Misfortune had turned out to be their fortune, as it allowed his family for generations to gain access to this glorious world. His father, having green hands, was sent to the royal orchid. He excelled there until he became the custodian of the orchid, their family's first title. Aramoros remembered the days of his youth where he was allowed to play in the fields of the orchid, partaking of the royal fruits at will. To this day, he still spent hours there when he wanted to restore his peace of mind. It seemed that excelling was in their blood as he considered where he was now from where he began. A journey of harmonic political execution that lifted his resolve every time he thought about it. "Oh, if you could see me now, father," he thought, as he looked at the large ring on his finger, the ring of the king's hand. His mother was part of the cleaners in the castle, and the fortuitous crime that brought his father to the castle also contributed in bringing his two parents together. "He was dirty from the orchid mud, and I wanted to clean him. So I did, and now I do every day," his mother would often say. She worked for decades, and now she was part of the senior advisors to the maintenance of the royal palace. She hadn't reached the top spot though, but he didn't mind. To each his own destiny. Thankfully, with his position, she lived in peace, provided with her own assistant to tend to her as she tended to her work. The palace was like a cascading house of small kingdoms in this regard. Each kingdom had its own little kings and queens and method of operation, with the present status quo. The king's hand was king when one went down the cascade. He smiled briefly at the thought, king down the cascade. All hail the king down the cascade. Now he needed to secure ascension to the highest office, second only to the king. Unfortunately, as long as the Grand Seer had the king's confidence, given the laws that protected them, he would always be second to her. He opened the scrolls, reading just how in debt the senator was. It was obvious to him that there was clear fraudulent behavior at play. All he would need is to expose exactly what transpired with the king's gold, and he would have leverage over the senator. Then that would be one spoke in his wheel, and he would have 11 more to go. He called one of his servants who stood outside his room and instructed him to find his hand. Adam was wayward at times, but he could get the job done in many ways. They had met when his political journey was still in its infancy and needed certain events to take place in order to position him in the right place. Such was the current case, though, against a more formidable foe. When the servant hadn't returned, Aramoros realized that they probably couldn't find him, which meant that he had gone off into the city, to the alleyways, to the area of the city full of the unsavory businesses. Adam was addicted to blue poppy. His slightly tinted blue teeth, aided by his inability to sit still for long spells of time, a clear sign of his dependence on the plant. He wondered whether he should wait or search for him. There was no problem with the king's hand wandering amongst the common folk, and sitting here reminiscing about times past was not going to help him achieve the future he envisioned for the kingdom. At the end of the day, they were leaving on the morrow, so he had to make sure he found the man tonight. Otherwise, to delay a trip because of a wayward servant would be disastrous for his standing with the king and downright embarrassing. Not to mention risk missing the arrival of the northern hand altogether. As he exited his chambers, the servant was returning. Aramoros did not wait for his report, as he already suspected the answer. "My horse," he commanded. The servant raced away out of view as Aramoros made his way to the front of the castle, followed by 2 guards, where he arrived to see his horse adorned in the royal colors of white, red, and black. He climbed on and rode out slowly, the 2 guards trailing him. These were not the standard guards as supplied by the royal guard, which was trained by the seer, but his own 2 personal guard, loyal to him alone. It was a difficult request to push through, at the resistance of the seer, but he managed to convince the king that he was comfortable
with the gods that had been always by his side, friends from his past, who he also wanted to assist with good jobs and income for their families. Playing to the king's kindness was what pushed it through. So, he had his private guard, only when he was in the kingdom or in the towns, but he couldn't escape the kingdom guard when he traveled between cities. It didn't matter. Small victories always accepted where they could be found. So he had his wish of autonomous and discreet movement, at least in the cities and towns. The city, just like his castle theory of cascading, was naturally designed in like manner. From the castle, one would start off with wealthy establishments to the east. These were the older establishments that were built when the people of Pim came from Dan. As one stretched farther to the east, there were larger estates, lands stretching for miles until one left Apex and entered the lands of Dan. To the south and west, there were the new city, smaller dwellings that could house many people, a lot who worked for the king, and the castle, hence their close proximity. Then, as one ventured further south, they passed the large market, where most of the businesses of Pim were completed. At the peripherals of the market were money peddlers, who always seemed to position themselves at the entrances to the darker door and alleyways of the city. The east and the south were separated by the Grandium, the large stadium where games such as kart racing, the gauntlet, and arc trials and demonstrations were held. The sands of the central ring were fertile with blood, wood, and an occasional death. Adjacent lay the many education centers of Pim. These were mainly for the elites of Pim, but the rest of them would find where they may in and among these buildings. The market never truly slept, and at dusk remained busy with oil lamps lighting up the streets, with some residents, those with some knowledge of archaeology, actually using spells to set up small lamps. Such spells were easy to initiate, so the Syria allowed them, but there were always arrests for those who initiated spells of greater strength. Of all the reasons Aramarus didn't like the Syria on this topic, they totally agreed. The last thing the kingdom needed was all the people casting spells on each other with no control, no order, no accountability. That would be complete chaos. The cobbled streets did their best to allow the dirt to flow away, but there was no hiding the clear and present smell of vegetables and meats that wafted up one's nostrils as they passed, the narrow streets becoming a gauntlet to foul odors. Aramaros really came down here. He usually used the road to the southwest, behind the Grandium, which was wide enough for the large carriages, smoothed out and generally pleasant. Odd that when one moved up in the world, the very things that were once normal became detestable, and those things that they detested assumed normality, as though the mind willfully declared that its situation, no matter how bad, how corrupt, by its own doing or not, was somehow better than that which was evidently better. He couldn't believe that in these very streets, before his father moved to the castle quarters they ran, ducked here, jumped there, just as the children were doing now, content and accepting of their evident plight. He turned down an alley between two selling stalls into tightly cramped buildings. The smell of smoke was evident, creeping out of the windows and open doors, stale and intoxicating. They finally happened upon a small building whose entrance sank down. Before they could enter, a group of ladies, girls in reality, converged on the entrance, not so much as selling their wares trying to entice the wealthy, but more a tactical move, blocking the king's hand from entering to protect the clients inside. An older lady appeared behind them. "Forgive my doves, lord. Rarely do we get such prominence at our doors." She bowed low, a mockery in itself, but these were not palace grounds, and one would take respect as and when they got it. "Okay, fly away, my doves. The king's hand seeks his hand." The girls eyed him over before retreating into the shadows. "Is he here?" Aramoros asked blankly. "He was.
He left. The lady's confidence was insulting enough beyond what she did or made others do for a living. She kept a hand on the frame of the entrance, almost in a way blocking it. They indeed didn't want individuals getting in. He peered over at the dark shadows inside. She moved, blocking his view, such that he had to look at her face. His guards moved, but he raised his hand calmly. She didn't move at all, as one would if authority bared down on them. She was indeed not only experienced, but knew she had some powerful men behind those walls, and she didn't need to fret the king's hand, or rather she feared others more. Besides the strong smell of emanating smoke from inside, she wore an even stronger perfume. "I'm sorry, my lord, but we do like our privacy," she said. "As I'm sure you must," he said, reaching in his robe. He pulled out a small bag of gold coins, picking 3 out. Her eyes sparkled with the rare metal, her currency. She reached out to the open palm, and he snapped his hand shut, causing her to frown, not understanding the game. "Who's in there?" Arameros asked. She tilted her head, blocking his view again. "My lord, I have answered your question, without deception. My establishment is clean and honest, with the tax to prove it. We operate within the confines of daily usage for each client." Arameros raised his hand, silencing her. It was worth a try to see if he would get some information from her and have access on the dirt of high-profile clients, but she was clearly loyal to her business. So much so, she kept the best records just to keep it safe. Then again, he didn't want to ruffle any feathers and have his assistant barred from entry. It wasn't worth the trouble, and he had already spent long enough standing in this filth. No matter the person, the market and downtown was not a place where one would want to be wandering, even with 2 highly skilled guards. He turned, heading out without a moment's hesitation. Madame Greta literally skipped to the room usually used by Adam and burst in. "I thought I said," Adam snapped. She noticed that he seemed a little flustered, battered even, with what looked like a bruise on his cheek, though she hadn't seen a dove in here for him. She figured it was his personal business, as part of their agreement, no questions asked as long as he paid. "Your master came here looking for you. Here, at my establishment," Greta rasped through clenched teeth. "I'll handle it. He will never bother you again, I promise." Adam decided that he would not turn on the power card and threaten the woman. This establishment sold a great concentration of blue, and getting a place so detestable that no seer or kingdom guard would tread or even think of treading had been impossible until he met Greta. So he would not jeopardize all that for a power play, lest he create a scene that would then surely get him on the kingdom guard's sights. She stood there, still evidently frustrated, hands on hips. "My doves are dear to me. My clients are dear to me. I said I'll handle it," he snapped harshly. Madame Greta winced away initially, thinking she had stepped a little too far in displaying her frustration. Adam sighed loudly, reaching out to her and grabbing her by the shoulders gently. "I'm not having a great day, so forgive my anger. Please, may you bring me a small pinch so I can relax a little bit? And I will handle the king's hand. He will not return here. Madame Greta nodded and left the room. Moments later, a young dove returned with his tray. He burned through it quickly. It wasn't really about the feeling at this point, but he had to put on a performance of a lifetime and at the same time not get fired out of the king's service. He returned to his quarters and, carrying a lamp, made his way through the palace to the quarters of the king's hand. Inside, Arameros was still awake, sitting by a lamp, his body half cast in light and darkness. When he saw Adam walk in, he threw his hand in the air. Adam remained quiet, hung low. He just had to wait until the king's hand spoke. There was nothing more to it. The king's hand left him hanging there for as long as he possibly could, before finally breaking the silence. "Where have you been?" "Apologies, my lord. I always on that poppy," Aramoros hissed. After a moment of closing his eyes and shaking his head, Aramoros calmed himself. "Tomorrow we leave for the east. Make sure you're ready at sunrise. I have a job for you whilst we are there." "As you wish, my lord." Adam backed out of the room, not wishing to engage the king's hand any further. He walked briskly to his quarters. The morning of the next day, Adam made his way to the waiting carriage. As stressed as he was, he had kept away from the blue poppy. Aramoros sat in the carriage, daydreaming, staring out to nowhere. Royal carriages were actually very large, about 10 meters long for a standard one. At such a comfortable length, he could walk up and down to stretch his legs. They were made of lightweight materials, such that it was not too difficult on the horse, but still strong enough to take all the rocking and shaking that took place on the journeys, and in times where the stags had to flee. The coaches actually moved very quickly, because all carriageways connecting main cities were laid with large flat shell rock, linked together. This meant the carriage could move at a very fast speed, whilst keeping the occupants at peace, experiencing only a steady, soft rumble. Add that with the length and the width, it proved very stable a creation, and with a skilled jockey, trip times could be cut short, which was an added advantage as the journey to the east usually took many days. Inside his carriage, Adam sat in the far corner, looking out the window. There was never much discussion in carriages. One would look out and let their mind wander as they watched the land roll by. There was food, dried fruits, smoked meats, and wine. But obviously, Aramoros' assistant would have something else more potent in mind. They reached the city limit checkpoint, and the carriage slowed to a snail pace as they negotiated through the large number of carriages and people who always coagulated at checkpoints. Not to mention the markets that sprung up as people sold their wares to the many travelers, leaving and arriving. The guards slowly cleared a way through for the royal carriage, and they were soon on their way. Aramoros looked at his assistant. "Why the long face, Adam?" "Contemplating the long journey that lies ahead, my lord." "I usually read. It passes the time better than anything else. But," Aramoros threw the book down, "let's discuss this current journey. I needed you here because we are off to see Senator Weevil. Now what he has done is misused some of the king's funds and mismanaged his books. So I will need you to find out exactly what he used the money for, because I know it's not just overstating his population numbers, whatever he may be claiming." "To what purpose, my lord?" Adam asked inquisitively. "Information is power. A man in debt is a slave. Now imagine if you have a senator of the oldest city in the east, a gateway to the outlands, under your control. What could you do?" "What would my lord wish to do?" Adam pushed. Aramoros' mind wandered for a moment as he fantasized on all he could achieve for the glory of the royal family. "Put the Sira in their place," he finally said. "Servants to the king, puppets on the royal family's hand, and nothing more." Adam got up and filled 2 cups with wine. He bowed, handing a cup to his master. They shared a toast. "I wish you success in your endeavors, my lord." Ramos turned to the window, looking out as the world raced by, letting his mind race just as fast.